Hi there. You're listening to the Everglade Chronicles, a reading. I'm Garrett Shave, the author. Thank you so much for joining me. This is the very first episode of the podcast, so today I will be reading to you the preface and the first chapter, as well as the description on the back of the first book, Memoirs of a Neighbourhood Queen. Now let's get started. I will begin our first episode of this podcast with reading to you the back of the first book. Imagination fuels a child's ambition, especially in the kingdom game. Step into a world where imagination rules, where things are treated with pure reality, a place where kings rule the playground. Jessica has been playing the kingdom game in the Everglade Meadow for many years, but times are changing. The once virtuous Queen Venus has become corrupt and power-hungry. The children urge for revolution. Thrust into a position she never thought possible, Jessica uses her impenetrable imagination, her courage, and her determination to change the kingdom forever. A journey of discovery, dreams, and daring, Memoirs of a Neighbourhood Queen explores the adventures and machinations of children's curious, playful minds. Things are real, situations are real. Jessica and the others learn quickly that the kingdom game is not pretend. Preface. Everglade Meadow was our solace, our own little world. To us, the meadow was a separate entity, one that did not join the rest of the living world until it was time for dinner or there was homework to be done. To many outsiders who strolled through its lovely paths, we looked as if we were playing some childish game. The Queen's reign, however, was far from child's play. As soon as you stepped across the little wooden bridge near the tiny pond and took a long stroll down the asphalt path lined with birches, you were within her kingdom. The path opened up, and a fine view of the meadow was welcomed into existence. It was a stunning island, surrounded by a man-made river with two wood bridges at the north and south. Surrounding the river, homes were erected. Everglade Meadow was the primary organ of our neighborhood, Everglade Park. The island was substantial in size. Our own little world engulfed much of the isle, with smaller patches of the outer forests acting as bases for the rebels who rejected the Queen's power. Everglade Meadow sported a western grassland which was called Sunset Town. Sunset Town was where the peasants toiled and worked, in accordance with the Duke of Sunset. I figured it was called such because it was the best part of the isle to see the sunset from, but the area had been named far before I became a member of their world. In the center, there was a steep hill with an old tree fort constructed. This was Queen's Summit. Those who were chosen or worked their way up into the aristocracy of our game would settle and rule alongside the cruel Queen. Below the hill was the playground, which we called the Royal City. To the farthest reaches of the eastern part of the meadow was the Lost Forest. It was a dense mixture of leaf and needle trees that were self-explanatory. To the north was the long and thin cloverleaf bridge that extended upon the north gate. To the south of us was Bermuda Bridge, which was so wide at least 12 children could walk abreast. That particular bridge was always a threat, because it emptied upon the south gate and the Birch Trail. Anyway, I seemed to be rambling along here. I only wished to get across that the meadow was our home, our world, our solace place. The royal season would usually begin in March, when the ice and snow began to thaw and melt. We would go there after school and on weekends always. We had our roles to play and our jobs to perform. By June, the kingdom was in full course. Anything could happen over a summer. Children might leave, people might get promoted, or even worse, the Queen would expel or banish those who had dishonored her. The greatest tragedy was when a child outgrew the world and descended into junior high school. When that happened, it usually left a void in our lives. The Queen was quick to patch any holes, and life usually went on, but not without sorrow. There was a year when one hole grew too large to fix, and the haughty Queen struggled to mend it. The entire kingdom fell apart. Like I said before, anything can happen in a summer. We begin with Chapter 1, A Season of Changes. This novel, Memoirs of a Neighbourhood Queen, has 12 chapters and an epilogue. Stay tuned for the reading of those episodes later. It was the beginning of March, and the snow was starting to melt. We had been waiting for this month forever, for the meadow was usually dormant in winter. Sometimes we would all play our little monarchy game, but it usually got far too cold to carry on. Despite our ages, and despite all of our apparent immaturity, we all understood the rules of the game. While many aspects were imaginary and pretend, the Queen's reign was not. Her name was Caitlin Hardy, and she lived a block away from me at 124 Eden Street. She ruled the meadow and had done so for as long as I could recall. I was merely Jessica Walker, who lived at 455 Everclear Boulevard. I was no one special in the game, but try as I might, I was constricted. I could not advance, simply because the Queen believed in family inheritance and not appointing. I was hoping this summer would be different, for my superior was William Shepherd, an older friend who lived at 650 Empire Avenue, just a street over from myself. William, while a year elder than I, was the Duke of Sunset by rights. He had inherited the position from his cousin, Daniel, who moved away 2 years prior. In his time as Duke, William had rallied the younger children and commanded great regard. As his royal attendant, I respected William greatly. I was looking forward to working with William again this summer, for things needed to change. He had become handsome over the last year. He was a tall boy with brown hair and sharp oak eyes. The haughty Queen Venus, Caitlin ruled as Venus simply because that was her favorite planet, was becoming more of a nuisance. Her edicts were unpopular and her laws favored the aristocracy. Having worked and lived in Sunset Town during most of my time in the meadow, these unpopular acts did not go over well with the little children that worked and toiled in the fields. The meadow monarchy was always strict about caste, and it was almost impossible for one of the little children to advance if they were not born into some sort of winning circle. The working class consisted of grades 3 and 4, who were peasants and usually slaves and servants. They were continually mocked for their stature and inability to fight back. The majority of the island was made up of commoners, which were children of all ages. The gentry, a step lower than the meadow's aristocracy, consisted mainly of grades 5 and 6, sometimes even 7. These children were more middle class and worked and lived primarily in the royal city. Most were guards for the Queen or acted as advisors. Lastly, there was the aristocracy and the elite class that surrounded the Queen. Queen Venus only favored grades 7, 8, and some of 9 as her prized upper class. These were very small numbers, but commanded large amounts of resources and children. What was I? I was middle-class gentry, higher than a commoner but lower than an aristocrat. I had no say in the royal court, but sometimes I would attend Duke William when he traveled to Queen's Summit to discuss matters of Sunset Town. He was often accompanied by Benjamin Morrison, Sunset Town's elected leader. You might call him a mayor of sorts, but he had orders from the Duke. The afternoon I finished school, the air was nice and there was a warm wind blowing. The snow was melting quickly, and I decided I would go to the meadow and see if anyone was there. Before I did so, I stopped at home to adjust myself. I was a pretty girl of 14, having turned in December. Queen Venus would say I was past my prime, but I continued my loyalty to the monarchy game. I had small, narrow glasses the color of watermelon that reflected my somewhat mouse-brown eyes effectively. My hair was a rich dark brown, almost black, and fell to my shoulders in light waves. I was thin, too, and liked to wear pencil skirts in the summer. Today, jeans would suffice. I stood by the door of our newer home, waiting for my sister. She, too, was in the monarchy game. Nearly every child in the neighborhood was in the game. You were branded an outsider if you didn't play in the meadow. My sister, having been a relative of gentry, got off a little better than some children. She had an eye for the military and was an upstart general with great potential. This was quite impressive since she was in grade 4. "Come along, Abby," I yelled up the stairs. "I want to see if anyone is at the meadow yet." "Coming, sis," she said back, rushing down the stairs. She had light blonde waves and blue eyes that reflected the river that surrounded the meadow. I was often envy of her unique eyes, for mine were simple and dull. "Do you think Ryan will be there?" she asked as we walked out the door. She adjusted her little brown leather jacket that made her look adorable. Her favorite color was pink, and she often wore little pink spotted ribbons in her blonde wavy hair. "I should think so," I answered, clutching my backpack. Ryan was a colonel last summer. He will likely be promoted by the Queen's major domo this year. Abby nodded and kept her eyes on the sidewalk. We entered the kingdom through the birch trail, past the small soccer field and into the mysterious birch-lined path. It winded a bit, with the river flowing at our right. It was high this year due to all the melting snow. Despite all the adult talk and lingo we spoke with, we all made heads or tails of it. When I first began my life in the meadows some 5 years ago, I did not know what a major domo was, or what the definition of aristocracy was either. In time, we all adjusted to the lingo and the overall language of Everglade. It was interesting how we all understood the caste system. But the actual notion of understanding it boggled me. "The water is high," Abby observed. "I wonder if that will affect the crops this year." "The water is always high in March," I shrugged. "Sunset will deal with it. We always do." While we were sisters, we lived different lives on the island. I knew the boundaries of the farmers, for they were my people. Abby knew nothing of the working class and even had an attendant of her own in the city. I was merely looking forward to seeing William in power again. "Poor Gabrielle will not be there this year," Abby said sadly as we rounded a corner. I nodded deeply. Gabrielle had been the Duchess of the Lost Forest for many seasons. She had moved at the end of last August. Her chosen heir had been a weird and lanky boy named Mark Glass. The forest would be different this year. We walked along the asphalt path and stopped at the Bermuda Bridge. From here I could see Sunset Town and the apparent layers of snow that still covered the fields. Abby looked over at the bridge and frowned. There was a child standing in the middle, leaning on a wooden stick. I gritted my teeth. Schuyler Thompson was at work again, ordering his men to guard the bridges. "Lord Schuyler has his men guarding the bridges again," Abby frowned. "I did not think it would happen this early in the year," I replied. We decided to start walking across the bridge, only to be stopped by the small child. Even though I was taller and likely stronger, I obeyed the laws of the kingdom. If you acted out or caused a scene, you'd be arrested and thrown into the metal jungle gym of a prison in the city for some time. Crimes were not taken lightly, and it was often degrading and bad for your position if you acted out. Cassidy Graham was a prime example of a rebel. I admired her spirit, but she was a bad apple. Cassidy was in grade 6 this year, and the Queen had taken to calling her Sassy Cassie. Needless to say, she held the record for longest time spent in jail. "What business do you have in Her Majesty's kingdom?" the little lad asked. "Do you not remember me?" Abby asked sharply. "I am Abigail Walker, a journeyman general in Her Majesty's Royal Army. I suggest you let me through." "I am Jessica Walker, Royal Attendant to His Grace the Duke of Sunset," I said before the boy could ask. He looked us over carefully and admitted us without another word. Past the bridge we walked up a small hill and then it flanked out into open flat land. To the east was the royal city, a large playground littered with slides, seesaws, small metal buildings that acted as houses, and various other playthings. Further north was the steep hill surrounded by foliage. At the very top, the Queen's summit loomed. From her old wooden tree fort, the Queen ruled effectively. I looked around. There were a few children playing on the swings, and 2 more were just talking on the path that led to the Cloverleaf Bridge. I only recognized them as commoners and not children I associated with often. "I'm going to see if Ryan is at the ministry," Abby said, skipping off across the playground. I took in a deep breath and headed west, along the snow-ridden path. People had been here before, for while the path lacked clearness, it had still been walked on. In the summer, this path was merely gravel, and not paved like the one going through the royal city. In a mere matter of seconds, I walked into Sunset Town. It was a small settlement where the children lived in pretend tree homes and worked in the imaginary fields to the west near the water's edge. It was a breath of fresh air. I felt at home. I was pleased to find Benjamin rooting around. "Ben," I said with a smile, "I'm so very glad you are here." Ben smiled in return. He had entered grade 7 in the fall of last year, and still retained much respect from the people of his town. He was slight of build, and always wore plaid shirts with jeans. His hair was shaggy and blonde, with freckles across his face. His eyes sparkled moss green. "I figured it was a good enough time to see the town," he answered, folding his arms. "We will be bigger and better this year, I know it," I replied with a smile. Ben nodded. There hasn't been too much action this year, at least not yet. The Queen has been to the meadow a few times this week, but nothing major. It is only Wednesday, I said. She'll be in full force come Saturday. I plan on asking His Grace if we may petition the Queen for another parcel of land, Ben said uneasily. The idea of asking Queen Venus for anything was disconcerting, as she often said no. I nodded intently. When the fields were harvested in October, before the snow, there was a large percentage of peasants working in Sunset Town. If we continued like that this year, we would run out of space and resources all too quickly. Good idea, but the Queen is likely to reject the Duke's offer, I replied sadly. She cares not for the commoners and only for those who fawn over her in her castle. I have noticed that her major domo, Schuyler, is already hard at work protecting the island, Ben said. If you can call that protecting, I snorted, setting my backpack down. He is simply using fear and manipulation like he always does. I think this year there might be a shift in power. Ben's voice was a whisper. My eyes opened wide. Why do you say that? Venus has been the undisputed queen of Everglade Meadow for 3 years now, having taken the throne in rebellion from King Thomas. While her power remains strong, I can tell that Schuyler Thompson is greedy for bigger things. Venus has barely any relations who could inherit either. Schuyler is her only main heir, and he is as ruthless as she is. Right, I nodded. She has a cousin who works as a gardener in the east, and another male cousin who works on the farms here in town. If any of them inherited, it would mean a huge downfall for the monarchy and probably a total collapse. This is intriguing information. I haven't spoken to the Duke about it yet, but he might want to make a move. As a member of the Queen's nobility, he has enough power and resources to annex the crown. The idea of William Shepherd as the king was like a summer's dream to me. William was strong, handsome, and charismatic. He would make an awesome king. Do you know what would happen if the kingdom should fall? Ben asked me. I smirked and then frowned. Schuyler would pick up the pieces and unify the kingdom once more under a reign of terror. Since he commands the military, he has lots of soldiers who would be ruthless in ensuring the kingdom remains loyal to him. It would be complete anarchy. Ben nodded rapidly and began rubbing his hands together. The Queen's one and only weakness is that she has no natural heir. If only we could convince the Duke to... He was cut off, for we heard footsteps. When they came into view, we simply stood still and watched. It was a military brigade, a patrol led by a few boys. Schuyler had fashioned little paper hats for his soldiers to wear, and they fashioned crude spears out of wooden sticks as their weapons. They marched by without so much a word, and we carried on with our little talk. I cannot believe there are patrols already, I mumbled. It is barely March, and no one is at the meadow yet. Have you been to the city? I have not, but my sources tell me there is a great resistance in the east. I swallowed hard. The Lost Forest was facing a ducal crisis. There is even talk of seceding from the kingdom. Again, my eyes opened wide. Separation? From the kingdom? That is unheard of. The forest could not, would not be able to reign on their own, Ben continued. Venus would swoop in and crush their petty kingdom, or even republic if they chose it. Ben shivered. Despite the warm wind, it was still winter. The sun was setting, and I knew dinner would be on the table soon enough. Talk from the capital claims that the Queen will announce when the season begins, he said. That may not happen until May or even June, I grumbled. It would likely happen soon, since there are already patrols on the island. Venus is gauging the power and knows that something is amiss in her kingdom. We must not look like we are planning anything, or we might be banished. I sighed and turned around, picking up my backpack. I was hoping this year would be different, but it would seem we are still living in fear. The season has not yet begun, my dear friend, Benjamin said. There may be many changes ahead. When I walked back to the bridge, my sister was waiting for me. Her face was grim, but she smiled when she saw me. Was Ryan at the ministry? I asked as we crossed the bridge. Abby nodded. He was, with dire news. I stopped. What is it? The Queen has given Tyler Crest the Duchy of the Forest, she said plainly. I bit my lip, bottling in my frustration. That goes against the Queen's inheritance laws. Why would she choose a petty soldier like Crest to inherit an entire duchy? What will happen to Mark? Abby crossed her arms, visibly annoyed. I haven't the slightest idea. Schuyler was there too, with the other generals. Ryan got promoted. I'm pleased for him, but the major domo was visibly upset. Tyler is in the same grade as you, Jessica, but he's at the bottom of the totem pole. Venus might be trying to establish something here, I said, thinking. This will anger the people of the forest, and I do not think they will stop at simple petitioning. I don't know what the Queen is doing, Abby admitted. We began to walk again. It would appear this season there are massive changes coming. That concludes the preface and Chapter 1, our readings for this week. Join me next time when we start Chapter 2, Saturday Arrives. Shimmer by Captures provides the music. Find us online on Facebook by searching The Everglade Chronicles or at Everglade Chronicles on Instagram. I appreciate your support. If you're interested in purchasing any of the Everglade Chronicles novels, you can find them exclusively on Amazon. Thank you and see you next week.